Okay, can I have your attention, please, so we could begin the event? Thank you very much for coming to this glorious new space that we're so privileged to be in. I'm Kevin Hassett. I'm a research director for domestic policy here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I welcome you if it's your first time in our new home. I am very privileged to introduce today's event, which is titled the same as the book, The Upside of Inequality. It's a discussion about a new book by our scholar Ed Conard, which for the second week in a row, I guess, is going to be on the New York Times bestseller list. Ed Conard has been a friend of mine now for going on 8 years. When Ed first wrote his first book, the publisher sent the book to me for the purposes of a blurb, and I was stunned to see that this guy who was a Bain Capital guy who didn't have a PhD in economics could write such an economically literate and thought-provoking book. I gave him a blurb, and then at some point Ed came down and took me to lunch to thanks for the blurb, and we've been friends ever since. But one of the things Ed said at that lunch was the darn publisher, they took all the charts out of my book. Because I had all these charts I wanted to put in, but they said that a lay audience wouldn't want all these graphs. And so as soon as Ed said that, I said to Ed, Ed, you're hired. And at that moment, Ed became a scholar here at AEI. Ed brings remarkable creativity to his thinking. I said this to Ed the other day, but I still think of it this way, that one of the most thought-provoking interviews I've ever seen was Paul McCartney being interviewed, and he revealed that he had never, ever learned to read or write music, which surprised me, being one of the greatest writers of songs, at least if you like pop songs of all time. But he said that he thought that the constraints of music theory and notation might undermine his ability to create new songs. And one of the things that I see that I'm dismayed about in the economics profession is that economics is so festooned with fancy mathematical models that the spark, the creativity, the thinking about things in a different way seems to be missing very often. And Ed has entered this space as a kind of arbitrage in a very, very interesting, as you'll see, and thought-provoking way. And to discuss his new book with Ed is another old friend of mine, Steve Roberts. Steve has been a journalist at least since he was the editor of the Harvard Crimson. Did you work in high school journalism as well? He did. But Steve is perhaps one of the most accomplished journalists in town. I've had the pleasure of being on the Diane Rehm show very often over the years when Steve is the guest host. And I found that Steve has an uncanny knack of sort of digging in and getting to the real nub. Steve was the perfect person, I thought, to have a discussion about this challenging and stimulating book with Ed. And so with that, I would now invite our two speakers to the stage and hand it off to Steve Roberts.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, thank you, Kevin. What Kevin failed to mention is that the single most important element of our relationship is that we are the co-assistant coaches of the same Little League baseball team. In fact, the head coach, Bill Morton, is here, but Bill, we are his assistants, and so many Saturdays there's Kevin coaching third base and I'm coaching first base for our Little League baseball team. So. As many of you know, this is a profound relationship to be co-coaches of a Little League baseball team. I am not a trained economist. My late twin brother, Mark Roberts, was in fact a trained economist, but some of that is rubbed off on him and rubbed off on me. But I welcome the opportunity to have this conversation. And Ed, I want to start with the title. It's obviously deliberately provocative.
Yes.
The upside of inequality. And you don't see those words juxtaposed very much these days. Why did you choose this title, and what was the point you were trying to make?
Well, I did steal it from Gary Becker, Nobel Prize winner, so felt like I was in good company there. To write a book that's really aimed at not economists, but the public in general. You have to break through the noise. The title's obviously there for marketing purposes. I also use it as an organizing principle for the narrative in a book. The book has to be more than just a bunch of essays. There has to be an arc and an argument that weaves the book together. I use different aspects and different myths about inequality to weave the book together into an arc. But the book is really about macroeconomics and what our economy looks like today relative to the manufacturing economy of the past, what implications that has for our economy, for low-skilled, high-skilled workers, et cetera. And I could have used different organizing principles to get to the same set of points, but I felt like this worked well, and after reading Piketty's book, I was a little frustrated. So
I gather, because you're not a big fan of Piketty's book, but tell me, what is the core of the argument? Since this is in some ways almost counterintuitive, it's certainly in terms of the current political debate. When give us the core of the point you're making that backs up this title.
Yeah, so I think there's two ways to think about the core of the book. One would be, what is the upside of inequality? And I would say that is a deep pool of properly trained, highly motivated talent that is endeavoring to create innovation that grows our knowledge-based economy, and that the United States has been far more successful at doing that per person and per whatever measure you want to use, than other high-wage economies. In particular, I often make comparisons between Japan and Germany and France as representative of high-wage Europe. And it's not only just the motivation of the individuals, more importantly, it's the institutional capabilities, the fact that you can get on-the-job training at companies like Google and Facebook, work in Silicon Valley where there's synergistic communities of experts, have venture capital being investments being made by insiders that have deep knowledge of the economics and of the investment opportunities, and that leads to a synergistic effect that makes our most talented workers way more productive than the rest of the world. I think if you look at, always it's a statistic that astounds me, but in the United States, 25% of our workforce scores in the top third on academic tests, and about 50%, 45% of our workforce scores in the bottom third. So you have one high-skill worker for every two low-skill workers. In Japan, it's the opposite. 50%, almost 50% of the workforce scores in the top third, less than 25% scores in the bottom third. That's a 4 times difference in the ratio between high and low skilled.
But why is inequality essential to your argument? Why does inequality a precondition for economic growth and success?
Yeah, what I argue is that it's the payoffs for risk-taking that motivate risk-taking that creates these institutional capabilities. So what we see in Silicon Valley, for example, is somebody's working at Google and says, Eureka, I've got a great idea and I've got access to the expertise to bring this idea to fruition, and they obviously, they logically take the risks that create more institutional capabilities that make our most talented workers more productive, as opposed to, say, if I was sitting in Greece and I said, oh, geez, I think I have an idea for a technological idea, the likelihood that it's going to be successful is slim to none. I don't really have a good idea. I don't really have access to the expertise. And so the payoff and the certainty of the payoffs are low, and so we see very little risk-taking in those economies relative to the U.S. economies, despite the fact that they've got the same education systems, the same talent, and sort of the same access to technology that the U.S. has, but we see much, much, much less risk-taking. I think what we have to account for is, why is there so much risk-taking, so much successful risk-taking in the U.S., and why don't we see it in other high-wage economies? And the U.S., for example, growth has been 50% increase in employment since 1980, 2 times Europe, France and Germany, 3 times Japan, at median incomes which are 15 to 30% higher. And those relative growth rates would be even higher if those economies weren't sharing disproportionately in the innovation that our economy is creating, that's pulling their growth rates up relative to what.
So your argument is that you need disproportionate rewards, either through the tax system or other incentives, to trigger, to incentivize that risk taking, that it won't happen without that?
Yeah, I think one of the factors might be the tax rate, but I think the gradual building of institutional capabilities and the rate at which you grow those institutional capabilities. In the U.S., we've largely grown this since the early 1990s, so we're about 25 years into it. We've created an enormous competitive advantage relative to Europe and Japan because these institutions, which are the byproduct of risk-taking, grow at a faster rate, compounding at a faster rate than Europe and Japan. And they've now, after 25 years, created extraordinary differences in the productivity of our most talented people. And I argue this is critical because there's a second way to look at this book, which is the macroeconomic way, as opposed to the upside of inequality, which is that in our information-based economy, there are two constraints to growth. One of those is properly trained talent, and the other is our capacity and our willingness to take risks. So you can think of that as entrepreneurial risk-taking, but risk-taking is actually a little more broader than that. That those two things are the things that constrain growth. And so what's left sitting in the sidelines when you bang into these constraints is savings. Savings, which is largely generated by the trade deficit where Germany and China, previously Japan, Mexico, because of corporate savings, have a lot of risk-averse savings, and we buy products from them. They, instead of buying products from us that employ our people, they loan us the money. That money sits unused at zero interest rates, and that affects the growth rate of our economy, particularly the upward wage pressure it puts, in this case, downward pressure on low-skilled wages. That this is a core problem in our information-based economy.
Let me ask you this.
That we need to solve.
Let me ask you this. This is not a good year to be arguing this, at least from a political point of view.
I planned it 4 years in advance for this very reason.
Good planning. You anticipated Bernie Sanders. Very good. You were the only one, apparently.
No.
But you had Bernie Sanders out there. The core of his argument was exactly the opposite of what you're saying, that there is inequality is a great threat to American well-being. You had Hillary Clinton, at least to some extent for political reasons, adopting some of the more liberal attitudes of Bernie Sanders to be able to compete with him in the primaries. And even if you look at the debate the other night, you had Donald Trump attacking Hillary Clinton for what? For her connections to Wall Street, for her rich contributors who use the tax code, who manipulate the tax code. He defended his own tax situation by saying all of her contributors do the same thing. So the dominant political idea this year from Republicans as well as Democrats has been the downside of inequality and the unfairness of it and the need to change the vast disparities in wealth. So tell me why they're all wrong.
So really the book addresses, it predicts two things. One is an issue about inequality being central to the election. I actually think it's become less of an issue than I expected it to be when I wrote the book. And the other thing it does predict is the Trumponomics, the grievances that have been put forward by the Breitbart crowd, which come through Trump. And I do think they're interrelated. But let's talk about the Bernie Sanders first. I once had a conversation with Brian Greene, the famous physicist, and said, how do we know that the time isn't slowing down? How do we know that the universe is expanding? He said, well, there's telltale signs, and he walked through the difference between the two. So I think if you believe, so there's two ways to think about the 1%. The Bernie Sanders way, we're all competing for a zero-sum pie. It's just a question of negotiation. You've got CEOs who are negotiating with their cronies on the board, and then what we've seen is a dramatic rise in crony capitalism that accounts for the income inequality that we have seen over time. The second way is the way I put forward, which is that no, it's really innovation in a knowledge-based economy that needs very little capital to scale up to economic-wide success, and you see the innovators being able to capture a much larger share of the value they created. What would be the telltale signs of the first one, that crony capitalism is rising? We should see a number of things. For example, we should see an increase in the entrenchment of the status quo. Do we see that? Well, Forbes 400 richest Americans, what we see is about 15% of them inherited their wealth. We see faster turnover turnover in the Forbes 400 than we've seen in the past. If you look at the income of the top 0.1%, the assets, 70% of the assets are owned by people that started their own business. If you look at the turnover in the Fortune 500, in 1925, 1930s, it was about 65 years that you'd be in the Fortune 500. It's now down to like 10 or 15 years. If you look at the cutting edge of that in technology, the 15 largest tech companies in 2000 have lost about 60% of their value. They would have lost even more if it wasn't for Microsoft, one of the only ones that's still successful from 2000. There's been 15 completely new competitors that you would have never even heard about in 2000, like Facebook, for example, which have emerged since then. So what we see is tremendous turnover in the status quo. Similarly, Fortune CEO pay would be another example. We see shorter CEO tenures. If you look at
But an enormous increase in CEO pay.
But what we see when you dig into that more carefully is a couple of things. First of all, it hasn't increased relative to the rest of the 0.01%, and you do have to have your most talented people running corporations. You haven't seen an increase relative to private sector CEOs where you don't have cronies on the board. You've got owners of the businesses on the board. If you really dig deep into what's happening, if you look at CEO pay relative to their own workers' pay, it has not increased. The increases have all come from creation of business both at the low end of the pay scale, where the workers get paid less and the CEOs get paid less. By the way, the calculation of the 300 times CEO pay to worker pay only includes CEOs in the Fortune 500. So it's only the CEOs of the highest paid employees. And what you see in CEO pay in the Fortune 500 is that a lot of the increase has come from companies like Google and Facebook that have no blue-collar workers, so the people at the top are getting paid about the same relative to their workforce. So it really isn't an increase in the negotiating leverage within a company, it's creation of new companies at the high end of the pay scale and at the low end of the pay scale, where we have a lot of influx of low-skilled Hispanic immigrants who are not working in the Fortune 500. They're working in restaurants and landscaping companies and things like that, where they don't have high-paid CEOs as well. You simply don't see the data, and I'd say the most important piece of data, by the way, in this is if we were misallocating on a level that would be required to account for inequality, we have to reallocate about $1 trillion of GDP to the top 1%. If we were misallocating resources at that level, we should have expected a slowdown in growth relative to other high-wage economies with more equally distributed income. We saw 180 degrees the opposite, an acceleration in growth in the US relative to Europe and Japan since the early 1990s. So where is the evidence? I think the other place you can look is in mobility. If you look at mobility, you see that the Chetty and Sayers study, the most recent landmark study, says there's been no change in mobility. If you look at the US mobility relative to Scandinavia, it's identical, except for the bottom 20% of Americans. If you dig into the bottom 20%, you find that it's the same for white Americans, it's lower for African Americans, and if you look at African Americans, their mobility is almost identical to single mothers and high school dropouts, which have the same effect on mobility across all races and all income groups, although higher income groups are obviously more mobile. So it seems to be more of a cultural issue than an economic issue. So where is the evidence that time is slowing down rather than the universe is expanding? All of the evidence lines up that what we're seeing is an increase in the productivity of our most productive workers relative to our least productive workers, and not simply a renegotiation of split of the pie.
A gentleman you're familiar with named Arthur Brooks did a op-ed in the New York Times this week in which he argued something somewhat different.
I think he gets some of his facts wrong, but let's go. I read it.
Fair enough. He argued that that the goal of public policy should be strong but evenly distributed economic growth. And in fact, he specifically took on crony capitalism as one, in his phrase, he used the phrase, to argue that that this was one of the causes of economic growth not being fairly and evenly distributed. Do you disagree with him?
Yes, I do disagree with him. For example, he said that all of the gains since 2009 have been captured by the top 1%. There's a lot of truth to that, but it's a liberal myth because it doesn't tell you that almost all the losses between 2007 and 2009 were disproportionately suffered by the 1%. So if you go back to 2007 and look at 2007 to 2015, which SAES does, which Brookings Institute does, it shows you that there's been somewhat of a fall off and then a recovery in the 99%, but a big fall off and a recovery of the top 1%. So what you see since 2009, the bottom of the recession is, yes, a lot of the recoveries come from the 1% because a lot of the losses prior to 2009 came. But to more importantly the point, I think the goal of public policy, and I do say, I don't disagree with him on the goal of public policy. I think I make the argument in the book that the talents of the 1% belong to mankind. They don't belong to the lucky recipients of the 1%, and that we have a moral responsibility, us lucky recipients, to put our talent to work on behalf of mankind, and that what the rest of us should be trying to do is enslave the talented 1% to be working hard on our behalf. The question becomes, what creates the maximum amount of value from that 1%? And I think it is abundantly clear that we have captured way more value from our 1%, the 99% have, than Europe and Japan have captured.
I don't think he would disagree with you.
So I think the goal of public policy, though, is to make everybody else as rich as we can possibly make them, given the world we live in and the constraints of that world.
But without government intervention in terms of distributing the benefits of economic growth, you and Brooks would agree that economic growth remains the absolute touchstone, the absolute driving force of public good and prosperity. But where he then adds that it shouldn't just be the distribution in a random or unregulated way, that there is an economic and even a moral argument to have some mechanism for distributing the benefits more fairly. Why is that argument wrong?
Well, I'm not like a big free marketeer, Katie bar the door. I'm for thoughtful government intervention that I think will truly increase the benefits to the 99%, and more importantly to the least fortunate in that group. So let me try to shift the conversation a little bit. What I'm looking for is economic policy that will truly deliver that within the constraints of the world we live in. So one of the constraints we live in, for example, is that there is an enormous surplus of unskilled labor in this world, and we can't buy for, we can't make for $20 what we can buy for $2 and expect to be successful in that world. The second thing we find in this new world is that there is an enormous surplus of risk-averse savings which are sitting at the sideline with zero interest rate. So I don't think we can simply wring our hand and say the answer is redistribution. I come at it in the following way. I worked as a manufacturing engineer. I spent all my life in manufacturing. This Trump's on, I think, the second issue in the book about Trumponomics, which I don't think he gets right, but I think he gets at some central points, which I try to bring forward as public policy in my book. We have a plant in Indiana, moves to Mexico. And we tell those workers, don't worry, the entrepreneurs are going to come and they're going to put you back to work and they're going to compete with each other and drive your wages back up to where they were before. And the only thing that's standing between you and high productivity is the amount of capital invested per worker. There's an enormous amount of capital sitting on the sidelines unused at zero interest rate. Don't worry, the entrepreneurs are going to invest that capital and drive your productivity up. And the worker
invest that capital in your hometown
and drive
because they invest it in Silicon Valley. That's not helping the worker in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely, but you should expect that some opportunistic entrepreneur is going to look at that labor in Indiana and say, there's an opportunity for me to put it to work. What they see is that the entrepreneurs moved to California and outsourced all their blue-collar work to China. And they look at the engineers who are left behind designing products in factories for Mexican workers, and they say, where is the talent, where is the risk-taking, which is going to come and put me back to work and drive my wages up? Now, what my book argues is that talent and risk-taking are the binding constraints in a knowledge-based economy, and that there are many opportunities for smart people to go to Silicon Valley and create innovations that will scale up to economy-wide success without needing any capital at all. And so I look forward and I say two things are true. We can't make for $20 what we can buy for $2. But what we don't want to do is buy things from China, have China turn around and loan us the money instead of hiring our workers and employing our workers. And we have no use for that money. That money sits unused at zero interest rates. And so I say, look, the first dollar of trade that is absolutely critical. It's about 16% of GDP is imports relative to GDP. Exports are about 13%. The first dollar, really, really valuable. The 16th dollar, break even. Where are we at the 13th dollar? Pretty darn close to break even. And if there's a curve, we're probably all the way to break even. And yet we are giving up a job to get a nickel of benefit from trade at the 13th percent of GDP. From the 13th to the 16th%, all we are doing is putting pressure on unskilled workers that drives down their wages and drives down their demand. Now, the second complaint is, oh, by the way, when I go to the employment office to get employment, there are 40 million foreign-born adults, 20 million native-born children, and there are 20 million children, 55 million of which are Hispanics, in general lower skilled than the workforce, waiting for the same entrepreneurs and the same risk-taking to create a job for me. And so, they look at that and they say, we want to shut off low-skilled immigration. Now, I look and I say, we have two big problems going forward in the future. The first one is, we can't pay for the baby boomers who are going to retire. They are going to demand their payments. We are not going to be able to defeat them in the political process. They have enormous political power. Bear with me for one sec, okay? We're going to get eaten alive by baby boomers. And after we're eaten alive by baby boomers, we're going to be eaten alive by the Chinese. 1 billion hardworking, talented people, entrepreneurial, who are going to have the economic and military might to compete with us very, very effectively after we've been damaged by the baby boomers who we're not getting away from. So we are not going to achieve this through organic growth. We have to have immigration in order to succeed. But what we need is ultra-high skilled immigration where we say we have 100 million workers. The top 5% is 5 million workers. We can go out and get another 5 million workers in the world and potentially double our growth rate. And to the extent we're then going to use immigration to continue to drive our growth rate, we have to look and say the 50th percentile worker today spends as much money in taxes as they consume in government services. That is not going to solve our problem in the long run. We have to get workers at the top of the wage scale who contribute way more tax revenue than government services that they consume. Keep in mind, the guy at the 50th percentile is not paying for his retirement, is not paying for anybody else's retirement, is not really helping the poor, is barely paying for military, because in the book, I allocate the military based on income, and the top 20% and 50% of the income. So
isn't it true, though,
50%
that one of the key differences between the United States and Europe is that the influx of younger immigrants, including those who are fairly low skilled, but they are paying taxes and they are help fueling the retirement system, and that one of the key reasons why Europe is far more troubled in terms of being able to afford their social welfare system is they don't have the young immigrants who are paying taxes, and that their age profile is very distorted compared to ours. So isn't there a benefit even of low-skilled and low-wage immigrants in terms of their contribution?
When I look at the tax data, okay, and I looked at the 60th percentile, and in the 40th percentile, you're basically underwater. You look at every tax, corporate tax, income tax, payroll tax, you name it, put it all in there. I didn't look at state and local, but only at a federal level. I think I could get a pretty good estimate at the state level. Those workers today, Americans, are covering all their government costs today. They're contributing nothing to the poor. They're contributing nothing to the retirement of other workers. They're contributing nothing to their own retirement because they're consuming every dollar of tax that they're putting in today. So we're saying, okay, now here's a guy at the 40th percentile, at the 30th percentile, and we think that person's going to contribute more in the long run. They're not, because people haven't really done and I use CBO numbers to make these calculations, so I'm not just pulling them out of my ear in order to do them. And so if you look at state and local, a lot of state and local is education. Don't we think that the immigrants are coming here to get their children educated? I'm not being anti-immigrant. I'm saying that our policy is not thought through. And that what we need to do is go out and get a lot more high-skilled immigrants in order to pump the growth rate up. We are not going to achieve this with fiscal and monetary policy. We're not going to achieve this through innovation. And that when you look forward at the problems that are coming, these are big problems that we're kidding ourselves about how difficult they're going to be to solve. So I am pro-immigration. I just think the mix between high and low-skilled is silly. And I look back at the Republican coalition, And it really is a coalition of minorities. So us free traders, who I assume many of the people in this room are about 25, 30% of the workforce. We are not getting to a majority. Now, Reagan fused the free marketeers with a religious right and was able to lower the marginal tax rate to 28%. There's other people in this coalition, the gun advocates, the foreign policy hawks, the libertarians, and a few other minorities. Together, they created a majority, lowered the marginal tax rate to 28%. I won't say the tax rate caused growth, but we did see a lot of growth in the decades after. The tax rate has gradually, as the demographics moved against us, moved up to 43%. And now Hillary Clinton's going to win the election easily with $200 billion of tax and spending increases. That's with taxes at 36% of GDP, huge deficits, spending at 36% of GDP, $550 billion of deficits, debt at 75% of GDP. CBO projects, over the next 10 years, debt's going to go to 140% if we cut discretionary spending basically to zero, which we all know we're not going to do. And spending as a percent of GDP is going to rise 9 points. On top of the 36, that's state, local, and federal, everything. So we're going to get up to 45%. If that's a prescription for faster growth, I'll eat my hat. I don't believe that it is. And so I believe that we Republicans have to do is we have to create a coalition that brings the Reagan Democrat, the angry Breitbart blue-collar worker, the person who Trump has been speaking to, but because of his undisciplined behavior has been unable to succeed for other reasons. And that is, we have to have trade. We have to have free trade. We can't make for $20 what we can for $2. But we don't have to suffer through trade deficits that put you out of work so that we can get one more penny of benefit in our pocket. And yes, we need immigration, but the mix between high and low skilled immigration is critical to our success and to driving up the wages of working class workers, because when you have an unlimited supply of unskilled labor, okay, who is the first person fired in a recession? Who is the last person hired? It's a low-wage worker. Why? Because he's a high-cost worker. Talented guys are cheap compared to the value that they create. Okay, it's the low-wage worker who's the high-cost worker. They're the first one gone, the last one back. So what do you need to do if you want that person to get it? You have to create an artificial shortage of low-skilled labor where you say, I have to work hard at transitioning that person into the workforce. I have to work hard at giving them the skills to be successful, even though they might have characteristics which are going to antagonize my customers and antagonize my workers. I'm going to have to teach them while they're on the job how to be a more effective employee. But as long as I have an unlimited supply of unskilled labor, I go, no, I don't need to deal with that. That's a high-cost employee. Get rid of them. Get me a low-cost employee. Oh, some guy that clinged to the bottom of a car to get over here for a job, that guy will do anything for $8 an hour. I'm much, much, much rather have that guy. He'll be thanking me for the rest of his life, where this guy's complaining that he's not getting high enough wages. And then we say these jobs aren't going to be done by Americans. Well, yeah, at $25 an hour, at $30 an hour, a lot of these jobs would be done by Americans. They won't be done by Americans at $15 or $12 an hour.
Let me ask you about
one guy's policy prescription relative to what I think are platitudes about how distributions. And let me get you one thing further, which is the book goes this. It says we are giving people in the bottom 20% about $30,000 to $35,000 a year of benefits, one way or another. Now there's a whole complicated set of wickets that we make them run in order to get those benefits. But a male Hispanic worker averages about $15 an hour, 2,000 hours a year is $30,000. It's going to be very difficult to get people to work if they can make $30,000 without $30,000 to $35,000 without working. Now, we're very compassionate towards the children, and there's always this, we need more and more and more compassion, which has driven the amount we're willing to give people up. But we have driven it up to a level where it is very difficult to motivate people to do work which gives them a lot of other civic
Is that really true? Because the fact is that if you look around this country, one of the biggest complaints is that people don't have work. They line up for every job that is available. They're desperate. Even in the Trump rally, say, we lost the dignity of work. It's not just they lost a paycheck, they lost the dignity of work.
So how is it?
Wait just a minute. Where's the evidence that people at $30,000 don't want to work?
Yes.
Because there are so many other incentives beyond a paycheck to the value of work, the ability to support a family, the sense of identity, sense of contribution, all of these psychological dimensions. And if you offer a job, you get people lined up around the block to job fairs.
But we know.
So where's the evidence that they don't want to work?
Okay, but we know this. We know that there's always this, we're hollowing out the middle class, the modern economy is not going to create jobs for low-wage workers. Nonsense. tens of millions of low-skilled Hispanics have found employment in the United States, okay? We know there is an abundance of low-skilled, low-wage jobs in the United States. Such an abundance that people are coming from thousands of miles away to take these jobs. And there has been no end to our demand for their employment, okay? Now, it's true that when we went into the recession and the economy went down, they stopped coming. But you wait until the economy recovers again, they're going to be right back here coming again, rightly so, because we are creating an enormous number of low-skilled, low-wage jobs in the United States. Basically, an unlimited supply. So the idea that there's a person in the United States who can't find work when tens of millions of low-skilled Hispanics found work, and they didn't like travel from Detroit to New York to get it. They traveled from Mexico City all the way to New York to get those jobs, and they didn't even do it legally. The idea that some guy can't move over 25 blocks to get it in the United States legally, it's a little hard to believe, don't you think, when you step back and look at the bigger picture? How is it that we increased employment 50%? That's like 50 million people. Half of those jobs were at the highest end of the wage scale. Half of those jobs were at the low end of the wage scale. That's about 25 million people that we put to work with almost no population growth over the last 30 years. So I look at that and I say, you know, we can get our nose so close to the paper that we do some econometric study that doesn't look at the truth. But if you step back and look at the truth, we have created an enormous number of low-skilled jobs in the United States. If you look, and by the way,
that doesn't answer my question about your argument that there are people who won't take those.
I would say that anybody who wants a job in the United States can have a job. Okay, we know that not only everybody in the United States, but a big chunk of Mexico and the rest of the world can have jobs in the United States if they want jobs. So, how is it that there's a person here who wants a job and can't get it? Now, did you go through a recession? Absolutely, we went through a recession. But I think if we had more logical policy, what we would say is, there are two people who are benefiting from the surge of growth, and then we know that we ebb and flow and ebb and flow. Who gains from the surge? The two people who gain from the surge are newly arriving immigrants and offshore workers who are substituting employment for savings that we are not putting to work, that are sitting unused at the sidelines. So we're running up big trade deficits. We went to 5.5% of GDP in 2007, prior to the recession. And we had an enormous influx of immigrants to take work at that time. And then work fell off. We should say to people, hey, the beneficiaries of the surge were Chinese workers and Mexican immigrants, so the people who have to pay the cost of the surge should be the same people who benefited from the surge, not the Native American worker, where we go, well, you're high cost relative to this guy over here because you want higher wages and you're kind of a pain in the butt, and so I'm going to fire you and hire this guy instead. It just doesn't seem fair to me as a matter of public policy.
Let me ask you one or two other questions, then I want to get to your questions. I want to ask one more question on immigration. You talked a lot about, and at the core of your thesis is properly trained talent. You use that phrase over and over again. In addition to the incentives to investment, there also has to be this workforce that produces ideas and holds these high-tech jobs. One of the key public policy questions involves H-1B visas and green cards. And the fact is, a lot of entrepreneurs, particularly in the high-tech industry, say this is one of the stupidest of all public policies, limiting H-1B visas to $65,000 a year, $85,000 if you include the extra 20% on top of that, $20,000 on top of it. Tom Friedman has argued many, many times in columns that we should be stapling a green card application to every graduate of an American university in the STEM disciplines. Is this one of the areas of public policy that can help create this pool of properly trained workers that you say is absolutely essential to your thesis for economics?
Yeah, it's the core proposal in my book that we have 100 million full-time workers. The top 5% is 5 million workers. There's 7 billion people in the world. The top 5% is 350 million. Half those people, we don't know who they are. That half of them, they're too young and too old. Half of them are never going to move. You get down to a pool of 50 million people, and I say the rest of the world should fear our immigration strategy, because our goal should be to get every one of those 50 million people here, at least get 5 million of them, and double the number of people that are driving growth in our economy. If you look at our highest scoring workers, they've moved away from math and science and towards business, law, finance, communications, places where there's networking, salesmanship, relationships. I was an engineer. I moved into the finance and business consulting because there was a lot more money in that in engineering. What you find is the rest of the world is rushing to try to create MBAs relative to their pool of high-skilled STEM workers. What we should be doing, I argue, is that we should go out and recruit STEM workers to come with Americans who have the networks, the relationship, the salesmanship, because they're living inside of our culture. Fuse the two of them together for synergistic effect that we can't get with just one or the other. And that is a critical part of the book. I also say that we should stop subsidizing college educations where the supply far exceeds the demand in the workforce, which is not to say that we won't subsidize all different kinds of college majors, but our subsidies ought to be in line with where the market is. I think the third thing we've seen is that if you're from a low socioeconomic family, your chances of graduating from college is lower for the same test scores, for the same capabilities, that we ought to go out and create policies which nurture that talent, that find that talent, that grow that talent. It's far more likely to feel the civic responsibility that I think our talented people need to feel than rich entitled guys who take it all for granted, that I see everywhere all the time. Those are three proposals that I make for trying to increase the ratio of high-skilled to low-skilled workers. The last thing I say is that we should be inculcating a moral responsibility that our colleges are teaching people that, Jesus, don't go into that terrible business. Those are all evil crooks, all selfish people. You ought to be in art history. And that I say, no, you have a moral responsibility to create jobs for your fellow man, because I worry about the following, which is there are three things that talented people can do. One is they can create innovation that grows the economy. The second thing they can do is they can organize low-skilled workers into organizations, into companies, make them more productive, help them to satisfy customers more effectively. And they can become doctors and lawyers and just carry on the functions of a normal. They're engineers on the train. Just keep the train working. Okay. When you have 25% high-skilled, 50% low-skilled, there's a shortage of high-skilled in America. So what happens is these professions are paid more highly in the United States. So people go, oh, I think I'll be a doctor over here. The second thing is, over here in innovation, you can scale up today because you need no capital investment. You can become Google and Facebook and get absolutely rich over here. So all the talent is running over here. The last place, the most important place, is supervision of our low-skilled workers, where we need a lot of supervision given the ratio of high-skilled to low-skilled we have. And we run this risk of having an economy where everybody runs over here and everybody up here wants to service these guys because this is where all the money is.
Isn't that the free market?
It is the free market, but my solution to the free market is go get another 5 million high-skilled workers, because you're not only likely to get more of this, but you should get spillover over here to the supervision of low-skilled workers that drives their productivity and ultimately drives their wages up. But what we're seeing today is a shortage of supervision because of the brain drain I described in Indiana, because they've all moved to the coast. They're all over here working in innovation, and the ones who are still left in Indiana are working on the outsourced work because the labor for unskilled labor, the cost is much cheaper overseas than it is in the U.S. And increasing the productivity in manufacturing has proven to be, I won't say easy, but a lot easier than increasing the productivity in services. And we've basically driven all the manufacturing employment out, because if you can get a labor at $8 an hour in Mexico and $3 an hour in China, there is no tax policy which is going to save manufacturing in the United States. There's massive amounts of capital investment at companies like GE, highly specialized, but a lot of that stuff's going to move to Mexico too. And I have a friend who builds factories for U.S. auto plants. It's 100% being built in Mexico. They're not, they every now and then build a token plant in the U.S. for political reasons, but all of that capital investment is pouring in over here. So increasing service sector productivity has proven to be very, very difficult and slow growing. And we're going to end up with an economy because of the free market, but there's no stopping the glaciers. There's no stopping the global warming in the short run, at least. We are going to end up with a service sector economy that needs a lot of supervision in order to grow it, and we're not going to do this with wishful thinking. We have to do it, I believe, by recruiting high-skilled talent and nurturing all of the talent that we have, because we used to be producing virtually all the college graduates in the world. We were like 80%. Now we're down to 10% of the world. So we have to look at our college graduates and say, we cannot waste them.
But including college graduates who then go home to India and China and other places because our immigration policies make it so difficult for them to stay. There are billboards in Silicon Valley that say, come to Canada, you can get a green card in 6 months. It's going to take you 6 years in America.
My frustration is this, which is I don't think there's anybody who disagrees that we ought to increase high-skilled immigration. So why haven't we increased it? From my perspective, the Democrats in the room can argue against me. The Democrats have insisted on linking high-skilled to low-skilled immigration. Okay, the Republicans and the Democrats have not been able to reach a compromise on low-skilled immigration. And they're probably never going to. Okay, but we could reach a compromise on high-skilled immigration, but we have been held from reaching that, getting high-skilled immigration increasing for 8 years because there's been an unwillingness to delink these and solve the one problem that we could have solved in this regard. Because there's a fear that if we solve the high-skilled ones, we won't solve the low-skilled. But who's benefiting from the low-skilled? Well, the Democrats, because they're voting for the Democrats, but certainly not our low-skilled workers benefiting from it.
Let me get to some questions out in the audience. I saw this gentleman first, and I'll get to you. Please go ahead, sir.
Name is Todd Wiggins. First of all, I want to thank you for the book, and I had a chance to look through it, and I always like to see some graphics to support the text. So that's a beautiful thing. But I wanted to ask you. It seems though you really expounded on what I feel is the conclusion that Americans need to have more training in language skills. As an advantage, because many of the Chinese that are immigrating are already trained in English. We're getting some Spanish and remedial German and French. I think that's standard operating procedure. But if China's going to be the biggest player, and Mexico's going to be the biggest player, don't you feel that it's very important that we reinforce our multilingual skills at an elementary school?
Yeah, I would say my quick answer is no. I think we have a huge competitive advantage that we speak English and the whole world's coming to English. Okay, I have my daughter learning Spanish since kindergarten because I think in order to supervise low-skilled workers in the United States, speaking Spanish is going to be valuable. Chinese would be valuable to learn, but I worry about I would rather have our talent focused on working on America succeeding. Do we need some Chinese in order to do that? Sure, but there's opportunity costs. You can be learning Chinese or you can be learning mathematics. I'd rather my daughter learn Spanish and learn math and learn business and learn economics, but one guy's view of it.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I've spent the last year researching this political campaign, and I embedded myself with both the Bernie Sanders people for a while, then the Donald Trump people. And now that I'm slightly medicated, I can actually breathe. And this topic is intriguing because they both are exactly the same except when it comes to racial and diversity issues. And when I see the anger, it really stems a lot from the 2010 stimulus. It's like it turns out it cost $2 million per job created. They really do believe there is cronyism. There was cronyism. And if there was an infrastructure stimulus that was real, that the jobs are created in America with the roads, I don't think we would have had this revolution, this revolt that we're seeing today in this election. I'd like to know, with the average person, we need to have some type of income distribution because the jobs that are created, like the auto jobs in America, they're paying $20, but they're actually the employees getting $12 because a middleman has come in. And we don't need these regulations, but these people don't get benefits. So they're only making $24,000 a year to build a car, but you've got these middle companies that have come in, and people are angry in both the Republican and the Democrat. Do you have any comment? Thank you.
So there's lots of things in there. People are angry, I think, for the reasons that I described, which is they say, hey, the entrepreneurs are coming, but they don't come. And economists have turned a deaf ear to them and said, don't worry, they're coming, they're coming. They go, I see reality, it isn't true. So I think there's a lot of anger. You see it in the Breitbart whole area. So number one. Number two, I'm skeptical that there's middlemen that are taking all the money, even though there probably are middlemen taking the money. They presumably are taking it for a reason, because ultimately I pay a worker a nickel more than I have to pay him in order to get him to take my job. And if he had another job that paid a nickel more, he'd take that job instead. So I believe the market set the wages, not that there's some big middle that somebody can extract for himself without creating any value. I'm skeptical of that. On infrastructure, I'm very much against infrastructure in the book for the following reason.
You
One,
mean infrastructure, spending on government
government spending on infrastructure. I think we would all say in a vacuum, would I rather have $1 spent on infrastructure or $1 spent, say, paying me my 60 years old, paying me my soon-to-be retirement benefits? Heck yes, we would rather spend it on infrastructure. But Larry Summers' infrastructure proposal doesn't work unless it increases government spending and increases the amount of government borrowing, because ultimately it has to put the unused savings to work. I'm trying to solve the unused savings problem by restricting trade deficits. He's trying to solve the unused savings problem by investing the money in infrastructure spending. But I argue that risk-taking and properly trained talent are the binding constraints to growth. So if the government spends more money, and if the government doesn't spend, I'm all for reallocating the money, but that's not what he's really talking about. Unsaid in his infrastructure argument is you have to increase government spending to put these unused savings to work. Okay, at 36% of GDP being spent by the government, do we think that 37, 38, 39, it's projected to go up 9 points to 45 by the CBO over the next 30 years when it gets spent on baby boomers' retirements? Do we really think that 36 to 45 is going to accelerate growth? No, because I believe that when the government allocates resources, it doesn't do it very efficiently relative to the private sector. And the reason for that is the private sector has no clue what's going to work. It's like evolution and mutation. We just keep trying stuff, fails, boom, we bump into something, eureka, we have the next Facebook, we have the next Google. Everything else quickly shut off. In the government, a whole bunch of smart people sit around, they go, I think building a bridge is going to be what's really valuable, and therefore we're going to spend the money on the bridge, and we're going to keep spending on that without any competition, without knowing anything about whether it's going to work. Now, I think the argument goes like this. I'm going to give you a whole bunch of ideas which look really good on paper. I'm not going to talk about how inefficient the government process really is, so that when we spent $900 million on the stimulus, how much of it actually went to increasing our roads? Not a whit. Okay? When California has a higher tax rate because they're able to tax Silicon Valley, how much of that is benefiting the students of California? Not a whit, okay? Because the real guy who's siphoning off resources over here is the guy who's not constrained by competition in the private sector that prevents him from just taking this, siphoning off what he didn't earn. And so you have this group over here that and the second thing they do, so they pretend that we've got all these wonderful projects, and the second thing they do is they go down the list of everything that's 50 years old, right at the end of their life, and they say, JFK Airport looks terrible. Yeah, except we just invested $10 billion in it. LaGuardia looks terrible. Well, we're about to invest $8 billion in it. The subways look terrible. Well, we just put $2 billion in, moving a subway from 110th Street to Bloomingdale's. Well, the water system looks bad. Well, we've been investing for decades in the water system trying to improve it. Well, the Tappan Zee Bridge looks bad. Yeah, well, we're investing $1 billion in that. So the only thing they come to that we've been turned down is building a tunnel to New Jersey, which might make the traffic flow better. Well, if you believe in global warming, do you really want everybody living in New Jersey? There's unintended consequences.
You're talking about my home state. Be careful.
Doing a lot of these things. And so I just haven't found the arguments, and I show you in the book, there's a guy who studies 123 different countries that have tried infrastructure spending, not the least of which is Japan, that ended up with 240% debt to GDP and slower productivity growth than they had before. It simply hasn't been effective as a growth creator.
Let me get a couple more, way in the back. Let me get somebody way in the back there.
Can I say one more thing about infrastructure? When Mitt was governor of Massachusetts, he said to me, one of the most amazing things is there's a courthouse in every congressional district in the state. Yet how often do you go to a courthouse? Once in your life? Twice in your life? Oh, you can't go over one congressional district to the courthouse? The reason why they're in every congressional district is because politics demands that the money gets spread like peanut butter politically over all the locations, as opposed to saying you're only going to go to the courthouse 3 times in your life, so we probably need 3 or 4 of them in the whole state of Massachusetts. But instead, it's just spent so inefficiently that it frustrates me.
I gather. Yeah. Go ahead.
My name is Dmitry Preobrazhensky. Thank you very much for the discussion and the books. Appreciate it. So you said in your talk, Trump got some things right, but he got some things wrong. And I think you discussed some of those things, but I wonder if you can just discuss maybe more in detail what you think he got wrong and what you think he got right, and what the Republican Party can keep and what it needs to kind of get rid of going forward.
Yeah, so I think when he talks about a big wall across Mexico, if you take Trump at the dot all the I's and cross all the T's, it doesn't make sense. you're not closing off trade. You're not sending immigrants home. You're not building a wall that's going to have any effect. If you think about it at a very high symbolic level, the wall means two things. It's about low-skilled immigration. It's about trade. Now, what does he get wrong? You cannot tax free trade. It's a huge mistake. That is what he is proposing. Okay, I am 100% against it, but there are trade deficits in this world that are perennial, trade deficits decades after decades after decades with the same companies. We all know it's a problem of excess savings. He could refine his proposal in that way. It would make sense to me. We should not be closing off immigration. We got to have immigration. We're not going to solve all these, pay for all these costs going up forward in the future without growing our economy with immigration. But we need to reverse engineer back and say, what do we need to do to pay the baby boomers? What would we need to do to be competitive with China after we're done paying the baby boomers? This is what we need to do, and here's how we're going to engineer our way to that answer. Now, is it going to be perfect? No. But is it better than just doing nothing, which is what we're kind of have this random policy that nobody's thought through? No. And I think that the fourth thing mistake he makes is he's just completely undisciplined in his behavior. Yeah. But I think the third thing he didn't do, and he probably would not be able to do because I don't think his policies are right, but if he were to adopt the right policies, say my policies that I think are right, but you can think they're wrong, but somebody would have to go and market those policies to the rest of the free market Republican Party. So when I go out and try to sell you guys on my economics, I am met with a tremendous amount of resistance. Arguments back the other way with serious economists who thought through these issues. They are not ready to adapt this. Very few people are going to adapt it the first time they hear it. It's going to take years and years and years. We Republicans, if we want to have a coalition with the Reagan Democrats, with the Breitbart, with the Trumpians, okay, we are going to have to compromise with them and say, you know what, we got to have trade, but we're willing to compromise on trade deficits. We got to have immigration, but we're willing to compromise on the ratio between high and low skilled immigration. If we were able to make those compromises, we have some shot at bringing them into our party. And if we don't bring them into our party and divide up the Republican Party, the Democrats just get a string of victories. From now, as far as the eye can see, our strategy cannot be to break the Republican Party apart. That is wishful thinking. Our strategy's got to be, how do we put it back together after this election? It's going to be very, very difficult to do.
I want to, ma'am, right in the back there. I want to get a couple people in the back. Yes, ma'am, you go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is about skills and properly trained talent. You've mentioned that that's important several times, and my concern is sort of where does that actually come from? In my experience working on helping people acquire skills, right, it not only takes a good education system, which is in our country funded generally by state and local taxes, but also it takes time, right? So somebody needs to have somebody, I send my daughter to school, I feed her, clothe her, give her a place to sleep. She doesn't have to work for any of those things. She barely works to maintain the household. That's another problem. But but if so many households are in this low skill work where they're barely earning enough to support themselves, never mind a family, how do they invest? So we don't have households that can invest in talent, we don't have taxes to invest in talent, and we don't have businesses investing in talent. So where does skill come from?
Yeah, I'm very skeptical that we're going to achieve it with education, and even if we found a way to achieve it, there's a whole chapter on education. It would probably take decades for it to infuse into our economy and actually have an impact, which is why I go to high-skilled immigration as a way to solve the problem in the short run. I also say this, and maybe this is going to sound a little bit callous, 65% of the jobs in the United States are pretty low-skilled. Pretty low-skilled. So, if you kind of, I went to a school with 750 people in my high school. Less than 25% of that school went to college. And so if you just sat there and absorbed whatever you were going to absorb, many kids are going like, I don't want to absorb anything, I'm bored, I'm staring out the window. But I think education was designed, if you do that, show up, kind of get there, pay a little bit of attention. There's very few people in the world who are using 8th grade algebra to solve 2 equations and 2 unknowns every day in their life. I always said I got very rich by solving 2 equations and 2 unknowns. The next level up is calculus. But there's very few people that need to do too much more than add, subtract, multiply, and divide. And there's plenty of people that don't need to know how to do that to succeed in life. So I do think that inside of that pool of 65%, there are very talented people who are falling by the wayside. And we are, testing people from preschool every year on up now. I mean, there's a lot of work. So are some people falling through the cracks? They absolutely are. But I used to be on the board of a charter high school, and every day they would ask our guys, the principal, how many people are going to college? And he said, among the people who are going to my school, you don't have to worry about the people who are going to college. That is the most overserved group in my community. All you rich guys swarm around the talented kids that can go to college. The guys you're neglecting, the people I want to help, are the people who aren't going to college, who could learn valuable life lessons, which would make them way more productive, that could benefit from vocational training. You think everybody's going to college. So my argument would be, let's take the people at the top third and really try to help them get more training and feel the moral obligation to help the other 2/3, because we're far more likely to be successful taking this group and tweaking it just a little bit in terms of the skills that would help them, understanding things like opportunity costs and sunk costs and certain other economic issues which just help you, I think, navigate the world without even having to do 2 equations and 2 unknowns. And then over in this group, I think there is a whole bunch of valuable lessons that we can be teaching people about how to get along with your fellow workers, how to get along with your boss who's going to be far from perfect and going to make you mad every day, all the time, how to get along with customers that have unreasonable demands, that ultimately, you're in competition for. If you can't produce $12 an hour of value that a customer wants to buy, we have this idea that employers employ workers. They only employ workers on behalf of customers. So if the customer won't buy what the worker's producing, the worker's not going to get employed no matter what we do to the employers. Do we have to teach our lowest skilled workers what they need to do to create the value that a customer will buy? I think we can do that, but it's not going to be turning low-skilled, low-scoring workers. All of a sudden, we're going to get high-tech workers out of there. I'd like to think we can, but we have found no technology so far that does a great job of that. So it's at the margin, I think, that could make improvements.
I got a chance for one more. Why don't we just take these 2, Kevin, since both of the gentlemen raised their hands together. This gentleman listed, but try to make your question short.
I'll try to make my answer short.
Thank you. I'm Nick Farmer. Can you speak, looking forward over the next 20 or so years, what your view is of the impact of technologies like artificial intelligence, data analytics, robotics, and how that might affect especially the low-skilled job, which is already in oversupply?
I think the robot argument is a very complicated argument, but I'd say is over the next 20 years, I don't think we're going to make enough improvements in artificial intelligence and robotics that it's going to have a big impact on low-skilled workers. Because if you look at the wave of robots who have come, first tractors, which revolutionized agriculture, then manufacturing, which revolutionized manual labor, then automation, which revolutionized manufacturing by taking all the labor out of it, and then by offshore workers, who are workers we're never going to really recreate through robotics, and then immigrant workers, who are great robots who we're never going to create through robotics, and then computers to increase the productivity of our most talented workers. Wave after wave after wave, all we've seen is increase in prosperity across all levels of wages. So do I think that the next wave of innovation is going to increase prosperity through the whole chain? Yes. I think when you look, I looked at the distribution of incomes in the United States. They're virtually identical except for an upward shift to where they were I think I went to 1979, and I looked at it for full-time white workers, Hispanic workers, and African-American workers, and they've all shifted up if you think about a middle-class person being full-time. In fact, if you look at the Pew Research, it says the middle class was hollowed out by 11 points. That's 7 points of upward movement, 4 points of downward movement. In the 4 points of downward movement, it's 3 points from influx of Hispanic immigrants and 1 point of downward movement from Native Americans. So in Native Americans, it's 7 up, 1 down. Pretty good hollowing out, I think. So I'm not too worried in the next 20 years. I think when you really start projecting out into the future and say there's this robot that can do everything at zero cost, I think you can imagine a world where we're all rich because everything costs zero. I think you can also imagine a world where you've got a small group of rich guys that have armies and armies and armies of robots working for them, and everybody else who's pretty much living in this economy working for each other because they can't afford these robots that make everything free. So you can see a scenario where this group goes off on its own with armies of robots. But this group, it's sort of like in farming, the reason why a tractor is valuable is because the displaced workers can find work that's more valuable than the now lower cost of food. Now, it's true that the displaced workers, in the case of unskilled workers, okay, they pay 100% of the cost, but they only get about a third of the benefits, because half the benefits are captured by the top 20% who earn half the GDP. A lot of the benefits are earned by the poor who aren't working very many hours, or the retirees who aren't working many hours. So the worker pays 100% of the cost for only a portion of the benefit. But if the worker couldn't find work that was more valuable than the lower cost of food, the worker would say, I'll just continue to be a farmer and continue to grow food for myself. So I think the alternative, and I know, Kevin, I look over to you, the math's a lot more complicated than this, but I think you could say, if the robots really come, there might be a whole group that ends up stagnated right where they are at slow productivity growth off the current base, and another group which rockets away with armies of, that would seem to me to be the worst case scenario. It's hard for me to imagine we get tractors and all the farmers starve to death, because who are the tractors going to feed if all the farmers are starving to death and don't have jobs to buy the food that the tractors make? The tractors wouldn't have any value. So the reason why you get offshore work, offshore manufacturing, the reason why you get tractors, the reason why you get innovation is because it's creating more value than it's destroying.
Let me go to one final question, sir.
Thank you very much, Larry Checo, and this has been a very interesting conversation, but I'd like to bring it full circle because the word that brought me here was inequality, and we've kind of gotten off of that. It seems to me, for every economics person I've ever spoken to, that growth is the panacea for us in our economy. And it seems to me that corporations are a bit disingenuous when they talk about low growth, because if they, as economists say, 70% of our economy is consumer-driven, how can they expect growth when people don't have money to pay for that extra pair of pants or extra car or whatever else they need? And the one thing I didn't hear here was tax reform. You've got, according to Fortune magazine, Fortune 400 controls $2.4 trillion of wealth. There's a billionaire by the name of Nick Hanauer.
Can I ask you
yeah,
to ask
the question. Yeah, well, Nick Hanauer would tell you that
I've
he's
debated him many times.
he's a billionaire. He can only buy 3 pairs of pants and owns 3 cars and all the rest of that.
It's the Robert Reich argument.
So how do we attain growth if it's not shared growth? Because all we're seeing right now is buyback in stocks. It wasn't Ronald Reagan's welfare queens that created this last recession. It was the high-end people that you say deserve all their wealth that created the Great Recession. And now we're all paying for it, and they're still not distributing the wealth.
So there's a lot packed in there. But let me just say that I'm going to go to the Nick Hanauer argument, which is if all the rich guys have money, they can only buy 3 pairs of pants, and therefore the growth is going to slow down because of it. If that were true, then the U.S. should be the slowest growing of the high-wage economies, because we have the most unequally distributed income leading up to 2007 and afterwards, and we've had the fastest growth, not the slowest growth. So there has to be something wrong with the argument, because it doesn't square at all with the macro evidence, which is Europe has a much more evenly distributed income, and they have slower growth as a result, and Japan has an even more evenly distributed income, and they have an even slower growth. And we can do the growth on a per-hour basis, even though I think it's unfair, because if you're in France and you say women don't work, immigrants don't work, low-skilled people don't work, we only get down to, even high-skilled guys only work 1,400 hours versus 1,800 hours in the U.S. And oh, by the way, they have more math and science than we have in our country as a percent of the GDP. You can jack up the GDP per hour. We could do that too by excluding everybody from the workforce, not having low-skilled Hispanic immigration, et cetera. I don't think that's the way we want to get there. But why is it that our unequally distributed economy is growing significantly faster than the equally distributed economy if the central issue is rich guys can only buy 3 pairs of pants, they've run out of things to buy. Because what they do is they say, I'm going to invest in innovation like Facebook and Google and Intel and Microsoft and Apple. And those are the things that are going to grow the economy, and those are the only things that are growing the Japanese and European economy at this point. And those things turn out to be far more valuable and create far more value for workers than me buying a 4th pair of pants, which I'm not buying, okay? I'm investing my money, I'm taking risk. And my argument is equity is risk-taking is the constraint to growth, and the number one constraint to risk-taking is the amount of equity that you have. Because if you don't have any equity, you're not going to be willing to take much risk. You got to have money to lose in order to take the risk. And the second thing that's driving risk-taking is properly trained talent, in that if I don't have somebody who's come up with a good idea that I think is worthy of investing in, and I don't have the workforce to implement the ideas that I have, I'm not going to put my money at risk. Now, what happens is, okay, I'm doing all that. Now there's a huge amount of risk-averse savings sitting over here on the sideline. Am I going to take my assets, use them as collateral, borrow all this money, and put all that to work? Twice as much risk as I'm taking. Now what happened is I went from here where I had 100 and I could make 10%, maybe lose 10%, so I'd be at 110 or 90, or I can lever up and go, I'm now at 200, and now it's like I'm going up 20 or down 20. But if I'm at 100, it's now down 20. At some point I go, I'm just not going to take the downside risk in order to achieve the upside. So I'm willing to put my equity work, but I'm not willing to lever it up and borrow all that money that's sitting over there. Now, what I tell you is, you know, I'm a little bit off your point, but you know, you look at who's going to borrow that money. It's not corporations, because corporations have become net cash flow positive. They don't need a lot of capital because we are not in a capital intensive world anymore. Rich guys are not going to borrow that money. The only guys that borrowed that money were subprime homeowners who basically borrowed it for consumption and got us back to full employment. They're not going to borrow the money anymore, so the money sits there unused, and we're now getting, the whole world is getting slower growth and higher unemployment and lower wages as a result of this problem, which I seek to solve in the book. But in the problem of pants, I can only go back and say, why is it that the U.S. economy was growing so much faster than the more equally distributed economies, if that's the argument that works?
A million people under the poverty line, and 1/5 of all of our kids go to school.
That's right, but that's not an economic, but we know this. The reason why people are in the bottom 20% is not because they have, that group is not working. And I'm not trying to say like they're lazy or whatever. That is not my argument, okay? There are lots of reasons why they're not working. They're handicapped, they're mentally ill, they're drug addicts, they are a single mother with 2 children who's got to raise 2-year-olds, you know, and a 3-year-old. They're not going to have a hard time getting a job. The people who are in the bottom 20% are there because they're unable to work. And I agree with you this, we're never going to solve their problem with growth. We can solve, growth will help us get the money to help them solve their problem, but redistribution is ultimately going to solve the bottom 20%. What really happens is in the middle. Now, you know, my argument in the middle is this: we should take the middle class tax and zero it. And if you look at the math in the book, it basically says it is zero. Because if you go to the store and buy a chicken, you don't call that taxes. You call that buying a chicken, okay? So you go buy government services, you should say, I'm buying government services. That's not a tax. The tax is what I'm paying over and above the value of those government services. So this is a conceptual idea. It's not going to really work in practice, but conceptually I'm trying to get you to think about it this way, which is, what should we say for a middle income worker? We should say, we're going to give you no taxes, but what we want you to do is buy the government services at their cost. And that's going to cause you to do the following. You're going to say, that government, why would I pay that for that service? This guy over here is offering it for 20% less. I'm going to buy that from the private sector, which is way more efficient than the public sector. And the second thing you're going to do is you're going to say, I don't want that service. I appreciate it, but you know that war in Iraq? I'm not paying for that. I don't want it. And you can actually set it up so that you go, if rich guys want to fight the war, we can tax the rich guys and have them fight the war. But I think what you would discover is that you get the same government services, you pay the same tax level, but instead of having upward pressure on government spending, Because everyone's saying, I'm paying the taxes I'm paying, so I want more and more and more for the taxes I'm paying. People would be putting downward pressure on government spending. And I think taxes don't matter that much. What matters is what percent of GDP is consumed by the government, because whoever spends the money, whether it's the government or the private sector, ultimately they consume the constrained resources, risk-taking, and talent. And if the public sector consumes it, it's not available for the private sector. It's all just a question of who you think is going to use those resources more effectively to grow our economy.
Look, this has been an extremely thought-provoking session, and you don't have to agree with this gentleman to be stimulated by it. And that's the whole point of this session. To throw out these ideas and get people thinking certainly got me thinking a lot. So really, thanks so much for a fascinating session.
Thanks for taking the time to hear me out. Thank you.